Hello, hello, hello. I'm here with Steve Lamos of American Football, and I'm so excited to be here right now. Steve, want to introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Steve Lamos. I play drums in the band American Football, and I am also an associate professor at the University of Colorado in Boulder. Thanks for thanks for being here. We're at Emo Con right now. It's been a blast.
We are here at Emo Con, and what I'm using for a microphone is an eyeshadow brush, so please bear with me. So, Steve, what I really want to talk about is a few things. I want to talk about American football, but then I also want to talk about your book from 2011 and pedagogy, because that's something that's of interest to me as someone who works for a center of teaching and learning. And of course, American football is important to me as an emo kid who grew up listening to your band and who grew up trying to drum to some of your parts. So this is a really big deal for me. So you chronicle debates over high-risk writing programs on the national level and locally at the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign in your book, Interests and Opportunities, Race, Racism, and University Writing Instruction in the Post-Civil Rights Era. You talk about how during times of convergence, disciplinary and institutional changes often occur, albeit to suit mainstream standards. And you also talk about how convergence and divergence is key to formulating new strategies of local action that can preserve and expand race consciousness and high risk writing instruction, even in adverse political climates. So, the first question I have for you is what led you to write this book in 2011?
First of all, I'll just say I wasn't expecting to talk about my book from 2011 at Emo Con, so I'm deeply flattered. It means so much that you've engaged with it and that it's had some sort of value. I was teaching, including during the time that we were doing American football, as it turns out. I was teaching in what was called at the time the Bridge Transition Program at the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign. And so Urbana-Champaign, if you're not familiar, is about 2 hours south of Chicago. And Bridge Transition in 99 was tracing its roots back to about 1960, officially 1968, but there were inklings of the program starting at about 66. But Bridge Transition traced its lineage back to Student Special Services, SSS programs, and TRIO programs. And these were federal programs that were designed to facilitate the desegregation of predominantly white institutions, especially, well, all public institutions in a place like Illinois would have fallen under this banner. But it was especially important to talk about desegregation at the flagship for the state of Illinois. And so I was fascinated by the history of the program relative to the students we were serving. Most of our students were students of color, most were first gen, and most were from urban Chicago. As it turns out, as a kid, my father taught at a place called Schurz High School, which is in Wicker Park. And so he taught in the city, and we lived in a predominantly white suburb. So even as a young child, I would ask him questions like, "Oh, we live here, and you teach in the city. You know, why don't I go to that school? Like, what's going on?" And so, you know, from a young child, I would have these questions about who am I relative to the place that I live, and where does my dad teach, and you know, who does he teach? Bridge Transition then was sort of my lived teaching experience, and then there was a whole history. And as it turns out, the Bridge Transition folks were incredibly kind with their archive. They had boxes of materials that not a lot of people, they weren't public archives yet at that time, but they were like, if you'd like to know something about this history, go nuts. And then the English department at the University of Illinois, Bridge Transition grew along with the writing program as I knew it at the time, and they too had archives, including boxes of stuff and filing cabinets, and they said, go nuts, and here are some keys. And so it was this really interesting history into how the University of Illinois saw itself, how it saw its student body, and it intersected with writing composition because that entire program was asking fundamental questions about what it meant to be literate and what languages students ought to be bringing to bear on their literate activity and their sort of pursuit of education more generally. So it ended up being sort of this really interesting place to study what correctness looked like, whose Englishes were valued under what sorts of circumstances. And part of, unfortunately, what I felt like I was finding in that book was the university, and I've used this phrase to summarize the book a number of different times. The university was seemingly inviting students in with one hand and pushing them right back out the door on the other, as a function of, well, the language here is incorrect, or this is not the language of the academy, or this is not academic language. And so there were these struggles throughout the history of the program, and some really brave and amazing folks saying, no, no, no. Citing scholars like Smitherman and saying, listen, AAVE is for instance, and AAV was not the only language at all spoken in bridge transition. There were lots of kinds of Englishes being used across the history of the program, but that was one example, and people could point to Smitherman and say, wait a minute, this is a rule-governed language. It has particular cultural roots, and moreover, this is exactly the sort of language that people should be using as a way to pursue their own kind of literate activities. That's a longer answer than you probably needed, but it was fascinating. And so to be teaching and working with students from backgrounds different than mine, we're coming together to talk about what writing means, what literacy looks like, and why. It was also an amazing community. Like, the part of Bridge Transition was a 6-week summer program where students all lived together in the dorms. It was a deep connection, and I think one of the things that program was proudest of is they had as high a retention rate as students who didn't go through Bridge Transition at a time when incoming ACT scores would have been like 8 to 10 points different on average. Retention and graduation rates were exactly the same. Wow. And so that was a testament at the time to just the power of that program, the power of community, and the power of students to sort of use their own language to pursue the things they wanted to pursue. So it was a really awesome program to be a part of. It ended up becoming a dissertation, and then it became the book. I knew less, I think, about interest convergence and divergence when I started. I was driven by this deep curiosity, and I'm still not sure I fully understand the scope of what folks like Bell and Crenshaw were talking about, but I think Bell's interest convergence is a really interesting way to start thinking about how and why institutions change. And boy, I think all the time about that book when I consider our present moment, but I haven't had anybody ask me about it. So I'll hand this back to you, but maybe there's more to say.
There's so much more to talk about. And actually, the next question that I had for you is about learning in the 21st century, specifically in a 2026 context. So you're talking a lot about language and how certain types of language are not deemed as appropriate for the academy. And as someone who works for a Center for Teaching and Learning, one of the things we talk about with pedagogy is language acquisition skills and voice, and how this reliance on AI is really masking student voice and student individuality. And it's doing a disservice in some ways. I'm not anti-AI, but I do think that, like all things, it is a tool. It's like a hammer. You can use it to bludgeon someone's head, and you can use it to build a house, right? And the question that I have for you is, if you were to recontextualize this book in 2026, what are some of the things that you think you would focus on from a pedagogical standpoint?
Well, that's a great question. I hadn't thought. I will say something about AI, but I am enamored with the interesting conversations, and I'm not an expert in these conversations, but they're relevant to what you're talking about. Conversations around code switching and then code meshing, right? And so code meshers say that code switchers are too quick to say that there are different kinds of languages, and you shift from one language to another, depending on context. And I think from a sort of a layperson's perspective, that makes a kind of sense, that we all know that there are times and places where certain kinds of language are maybe more appropriate than others, say. Code meshers say, no, 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 that's too simplistic, and it's potentially problematic, because what it suggests is that languages are in fact different. Unfortunately, I would say code meshers might suggest that sometimes code switching is itself a code for, well, use correct academic English in this context, and you can use your less correct other languages and other kind of. The meshers, it seems to me, and I'm thinking of Vershawn Young, but I'm also thinking of Suresh Kanagaraj and some other folks that I've really learned a lot from reading their work, talk about what's new when you take languages that are ostensibly separate and blend them into a new thing. I think these days, pedagogically, I would want to. And now I'm embarrassed. We got to do this in the next Writing with Music class. We gotta have a unit on code meshing, because somebody like Kendrick, to me, is like the ultimate code mesher. There's a kind of impossible to otherwise represent what Kendrick's doing without the ways in which he meshes different languages together to create this new thing. And it's also cool, and it's also, like I was talking about pulsional moments in my talk yesterday. The pulsional moments, my son's running around the house screaming about be humble, sit down, be humble. Like, kid, that's a code meshing moment. Like, right, we should talk about all the ways in which, I'm glad you're doing that, but let's talk some about where Kendrick's coming from and what's happening. But what a useful moment, even with my 14-year-old son, right? Mm-hmm. And like, we talked about, the closest we got to meshing is we talked about the Bad Bunny Super Bowl, mm-hmm. and we talked about Kendrick's Super Bowl, mm-hmm. and the kind of multimodal meshing that went on across those two Super Bowl appearances during the Trump era. Mm-hmm. And I love this. I think that's the beauty of trying to talk about this right now, because Kendrick was doing so many things, mm-hmm. in that Super Bowl show. Oh, yeah. And Bad Bunny we talked a lot about this. I grew up, my mother's a Polish immigrant, and I grew up Catholic. And do you remember in the Super Bowl video, the kid sleeping on the chair?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
I can't tell you how many weddings I went to where I was that kid sleeping on the chair, or like now we're kicking our kids off the chair. And I was talking to several students in my class who are Mexican American, of Mexican descent, and grew up Catholic, and we were just kidding, like, oh, kids sleeping on the chair. The kind of multimodal meshing that was going on in that space, given the discourse that we inhabit right now, and then Kendrick last year. This is where the writing with music and the language politics probably need to be made more explicit. So thank you. I hadn't thought about it using quite that language in a while. You had asked me, though, about interest convergence and divergence, and that's tricky business right now, because there's things I can't even fully divulge, like all of the headaches that my colleagues, and to some extent but it doesn't matter. I'm an old white guy with tenure. Some of my colleagues of color have experienced on our campus through the anti-DEI thing in the last 9 months. It's like, it's real, it's real, and it's traumatic. Nonetheless, I think a number of my colleagues have figured out, all right, interests have clearly diverged at the moment. So interest convergence, the shortest explanation that I can give, and I hope this makes sense to folks. Bell talks about the ways in which...
Bell is in Bell.
Sorry, it's Derek Bell.
Thank you.
Derek Bell, yes, apologies, yeah. Derek Bell talks about the ways in which things that might be coded as a kind of progress towards something like racial justice involve the convergence of seemingly disparate points of view and seemingly different interests, seemingly different values. I would suggest that Derek Bell is a legal pragmatist and was ultimately much more interested in outcomes, right, than in sort of ideological agreement. I think he would be maybe the first to point out instances in which something that looked like racial justice emerged when the goals of, say, students of color would merge with the goals of an administration, where the administration's like, well, we're worried about unrest on our campus. So you've got students, activists saying, hey, we need this thing, and a campus administration, maybe they don't agree with the thing that the student activists are asking for, but their interest in the students converge because of administrators, and we saw this in the first chapter in 68. Mm-hmm. Administrators are terrified. Oh my gosh, if we don't build this program, we're gonna have unrest. And one of the most interesting timelines, and now you're refreshing my, U of I's administration had sort of dragged their feet with building the SEOP, it was originally called Special Educational Opportunity Program, for about 2 years. King is assassinated April 4th, 68. That program is on the books and running by September 68. And there was an archive full of clippings from Chicago Tribune, Chicago Sun-Times, other places saying campus unrest can be an all-time high. In the wake of King's assassination, we got to do something. Mm-hmm. There's classic interest convergence to me, right? So you've got the interests of activists now merging with the interests of people who are not activists, but see their own thing at risk. Yeah. Fast forward to 2026, when in the Trumpian age, one cannot utter the letters D, E, or I, much less talk about the kinds of programs that the bridge transition was. Even CTL in a certain way is suffering under a kind of like anti-DEI regime. It would appear that interests have vastly diverged, right? And to the point where it feels somewhat hopeless. I'm nonetheless encouraged by the ways in which smart and brave people are doing the work that they were doing anyway, figuring out sort of ways to circumvent that. And maybe, I'm trying to think, maybe you can help me out. I'm trying to think of a good example right now of a kind of subtle convergence, when that is to say things are happening, because they clearly are still happening. They're not happening in the ways that they were even a year ago. But I'm trying to think of a good example in which someone is still able to teach material that would have been labeled DEI a year ago in a new way. So maybe this writing with music thing is it, right? Hey, we're gonna. Yeah. So there's a great. We talked about both of those Super Bowls. I think we talked about them in meaningful sort of ways. And the Super Bowl performance actually is a great example of interest. Now I'm back on my game. All right. That's a great example.
I knew you would get there, especially when you were talking about the Super Bowl. I was like, he's going to bring it back to
I'm
the
sorry.
Super Bowl performances.
We've had an amazing conference. Also tired, but that is a perfect example. Both of those, in fact, when a kind of literacy sponsor as powerful as the NFL, with all of the problems that can be attached to that sport and the damage that it does to athletes, nonetheless sponsors these last two cultural moments, there's a powerful meta example of interest convergence. And so maybe we can derive some sort of energy on our lower level where it seems like all hope is lost. No, the NFL of all things, who at the end of the day is perfectly happy to throw Colin Kaepernick under the bus when it needs to, nonetheless did a thing in both of those Super Bowl shows that it didn't have to do. And as a result, we're having all these powerful conversations. Boy, yeah, I wish I would have come to that. It's been a long day. But I think that's a great example on the meta.
I like seeing how you got there. I think that the journey of how you got there.
Thank you. I like seeing the journey of how you got there, and I think getting a little bit of insight into where your brain is and how you're bringing these things together is really fascinating. So I'm glad that you went down this train of thought.
Yeah, thanks. I feel slow, but I mean, what's been so fun? We're at this conference and we've been talking about all these different sort of phases of emo music and pedagogical implications, theoretical implications, a lot of practical implications. There were panels on how to tune guitars. It turns out I didn't catch any of those, but this conference, in a certain kind of way, I suppose, if you were to pan the camera back far enough, would be a kind of interest convergence moment, but not with a kind of racial justice, although that's not true, because the panel you were on was all about racial justice. So here's a moment where our love of a music is also forcing us to have a set of critical conversations about who gets to be part of it. So that's another nice example here. But what I also like about this is if in fact what we've been talking about at this conference, that there's a sort of interesting moment where this kind of conversation has a push and maybe we can get more out of it, then maybe we take hope from this as another instance where we can have these fun pop culture conversations about music, but get to serious issues as well. So I think we've got a couple of contemporary examples that it took me a while to get there, but yeah, I think they're related to the actual question you asked me 38 minutes ago. Yeah.
No, it's fine. Like I said, I'm all about the journey of how you get to your answer. And in that journey, it's making me think of quite a few things. Interest divergence is something that is very important to me, again, as someone who works for a center of teaching and learning, specifically in the Trump administration, specifically in 2026, working at an HSI, a Hispanic serving institution, where we have a lot of first generation immigrant students that are speaking a plethora of different languages, right? And have a plethora of lived experiences that are impacting how they show up inside the classroom, outside of the classroom. Obviously, we have to think about the administration and the powers that be on a college level, on a university level, but then we think about the powers that be on a political level as well. And we're trying to think about the interest convergence of things on a national level, things on a state level, things on a hyper local level. Like, it's a lot of stuff coming together. So actually, that's something that I wanted to talk about in terms of convergence and bringing all these things together. I'm going to transition a little bit clumsily now into American football, but I want to transition into making music with your friends. It's the 90s. 1998 is when it came out, if I don't mistake.
99 was the LP, and 98 was the first little EP.
Thank you.
Yeah.
EP was 98, LP was 99. Talk to me about interest convergence in terms of working in a band and the dynamics of working with the band, creating music, having a certain sound that you're going for, having a certain message that you want to share, but trying to figure out how you're going to be perceived in the context of the music making that you're engaging with.
That's a great question. What I'll say, and it's not a one-to-one, because I think what Belle is talking about in particular has so much to do with kind of justice-oriented issues. And I will tell you that we started making music because it was fun. There was no particular sort of agenda other than to pursue something that we had a passion for. And of course, that's a political act too. To be free.
I was about to say, Audre Lorde, that's self-care is an act of political warfare, so.
And in that sense, it's the most precious gift that anybody can receive, is to be able to chase after something that they find interesting. I will say that there is a kind of analog to interest convergence, I guess, when you start understanding that to make music is one dimension of kind of how this all operates. But of course, that music has to be circulated. That music has to be recorded. If you're lucky enough to be involved with a record label, and I will say the good folks at Polyvinyl, we've had a relationship with them for now almost 30 years. From day one, they are among the most ethical and decent folks we've ever dealt with, and that is not something that often gets said in the music business. But interests around the artistic interests and economic interests, when things go right, they run in parallel. Sometimes they conflict. I think we've been quite fortunate in that most often, most of the time, they've run in parallel quite nicely. But you can't, it's impossible to deny that there is an economic dimension to everything at this conference. And that including some of the bands that we're talking about, there's a lot of time, money, and effort being expended by lots of different folks. And when that's bad, it's this sort of capitalist exploitation. I do think, though, one of the beauties of this kind of music, and especially in the more indie mode, is that it's better than that. People are there. When this scene is at its most ethical, or when a particular version of the scene is at its most ethical, people are all kind of pulling in the same direction. Artistic vision and economic visions are, I think, running in parallel, and there's a kind of ethic of care for the music, the bands, but also the people in the scene itself, also the folks who are helping to make the music happen. And so I would hope that in the best scenario, those interests are all kind of running in parallel. We, when we were young kids, did this because it was a fun and enjoyable way to spend time. We also lived in a place that was quite inexpensive. We were all really close together. I was recently revisited Urbana for the first time, literally in probably 10 years, and I lived there almost 15 years, and it had only been back 2 or 3 times. It's amazing how close we all were, and how cheap it was to live there, and how part of that whole music scene was really because it was like an 8-block basis, and you just see people, and we'd rehearse 3 times a week because it was easy. They could just walk over and do the thing. My students now live in a different world that's more expensive, where you can't be for those periods of time. And so, yeah, there were some things about where we were able to first start making music together that were pretty special. And I wish students now had access to those things. But as part of the theme of this whole conference, it was a pretty white male, pretty white boy kind of vibe. And I think emo is, I hope, more inclusive now than it was in the 90s. And I feel like I've had to learn and grow a lot about my own sort of positionality and embodiment in the last 30 years myself, because I don't think I was thinking enough about those aspects of things. We were just doing a thing. We thought we were just doing a thing, right? So I hope that somewhere in there was an answer to your question, I think. But
Yes.
it was meandering, again, yeah.
There was definitely an answer to my question and all of that. And actually, something that I would love to follow up with you on is, what are some of the things that you've learned in the past about 30 years? And going from, yeah, we were just a couple of white dudes who wanted to make some music and it was fun, to, hey, we have an album coming out soon. And I heard your latest EP that dropped on Wednesday. I gotta say, Bad Moons. I have so many questions about that. I love it. And I love the music video for it, by the way. But can you talk to me a little bit more about what that evolution has been like from you, from being a bunch of dudes who are some, white dudes from Illinois, and we're going to make some music and it's going to be great, to, okay, we're in a band again and it's a 2026 context and we are, a canonical emo band, but also you guys broke up before you guys even got all that notoriety and now you're popular. Like, talk to me about what an evolution has looked like in terms of your own identity and being a white, presumably cis male in the emo scene, and how that's evolving in 2026.
Thank you for asking that question. I don't, so much has changed. And I want to say that the scene has evolved in ways that, I'll speak only for me, that have forced me to evolve, right? To force me to think, because I don't think as a kid, I spent a lot of time with Miles Davis. Love Miles Davis. And I said this sort of in passing in the keynote, like, my own invented nostalgia was like, I want to be part of that world, right? But there was always this kind of sense of like, as I'm a white kid in the suburbs, and that's African American music, and like I can't just import myself there, right? Like,
on behalf of someone who grew up playing jazz and played jazz with a lot of white boys who like to insert themselves into the jazz lineage, thank you for not doing that.
Yeah, it's.
You know who you are.
but the tension or the paradox of that is the love of that music forced me to constantly think about that, but I hope in a useful kind of way. And as I was starting to allude to in that talk, like, I learned more about true U.S. history from reading biographies and autobiographies of Miles than I did in my history classes. So I would try to come to terms with what it meant for Miles to get. I'm trying not to use profanity in these, but I gotta say, Miles getting the shit kicked out of him in front of his own club, under his own marquee. Like, what is this? Where's this place that I live? And again, like, I live in a white suburb. My father travels to Chicago every day. He's working with folks of color. Like, what are these politics? Some of that must have been sort of bubbling in the back of my head a little bit when we were doing American football, but in some ways it wasn't. It was like, these are my friends, we're just going to do this thing. And I think there are times and places where it makes perfect sense for somebody to just sort of, I'm glad I'm with my friends, I want to do my thing, I'm not going to overthink this. Mm-hmm. But what I'm so happy about is I think that this scene has evolved to include more voices. I think necessary critique has happened again and again and again over 30 years. People from Jessica Hopper, I was on a panel about Haley Williams and some of the critiques that she's made. Some of the amazing folks that I've met at this conference, including you, offering these sort of like incredibly important critiques about who gets to speak and play and be taken seriously in this world. And so what I want to say, and I do say this to my writing with music students, the beauty of music is we can sit with multiple paradoxes sometimes at the same time. So music is radically embodied, unique only to you, whatever your physical frame is at this moment. So you can sit with that and think, I'm me, right? Whatever me is. Immediately, though, you almost have to go to, all right, where's this physical frame? How is it situated in relation to the larger world? What has the larger world done to it or is doing to it right now? What's beautiful about that? What's terrifying about that? What's potentially exciting about it? And how has the world beaten this frame down, and how has it beaten other frames down? Like trying to understand a self, but also immediately moving to this kind of like, well, we live in a reality. And my embodiment is part of that reality. I have privileges as a function of that. I have to recognize the ways in which those privileges negatively affect other people. Like what is my ethical responsibility as a music fan to understand that and to do something about it? We can also, though, at the same time, for these fleeting moments, and I saw that throughout this whole conference, there's a kind of loving critique, right? This notion of, we got to do something different, but for fleeting moments, we can geek out on the video that you're on the screen, and everyone in this room is like, that is a killer performance. Well, we can all live in there just for a second. And I feel like that's the energy for making the change. Because there are these moments where everybody's glued to that screen and just like, man, this is special. This is a moment where we transcend this thing just for a second. And when we snap back to either that self or the self in the world and embodiment and all the ways in which this world is a cruel and horrible place to reside, we sit with all three of those phases at once. And hopefully, that's one of the things I was hoping to sort of stress toward in the stuff that I was talking about yesterday, this kind of ethical mattering. Like you have a responsibility to make the world as full as it can be, and that includes a responsibility to other people to ensuring that a situation like this one allows for maximum thriving and to correct the problems, including things like systemic racism, racism within a scene that prevent people from maximum thriving. So I hope that makes a kind of sense.
Totally. Actually, I have a follow-up question for you actually about this, and then we can transition more into the nitty-gritty drum part, because as a fellow drummer, I'm like, I got some questions for you. But what do you think your ethical responsibility is as someone who is a part of a band that has notoriety, a band that has fame, a band that is putting out new music, a band that is going on tour, and is again recognized as a canonical emo band? What do you think your personal responsibility is at this time?
Oh boy, that's such a great question, and I hope I can answer it adequately. I mean, I think, gosh, there's a lot of phases of responsibility. I think I'll start with the easiest one. I quit the band for a while. I came back, and one of the things I sort of resolved on a personal level coming back was to not take things for granted, and to try to take seriously the way in which we're lucky enough to participate in something that's way bigger than us. And what I mean by that is like the energy around all of this. Like I believe that music is just indexing some sort of larger energy force, and it is a positive force. It is a force that orients us toward the better rather than the worse, and to try not to take that for granted on a personal level. But I also think, I'll speak only for myself. I don't want to speak for the other people in the band. But to come to an event like the one that we've just been at for the last couple of days and take seriously the words of scholars and thinkers from all of these different backgrounds, and take seriously what they're saying, and try to understand what it's going to mean in order to enact the kind of inclusivity that folks have been talking about, to try to make sure that the events we put on, the concerts that we do, are welcoming spaces as opposed to spaces of, where people feel like they can't be themselves or feel excluded or feel threatened or any of those sorts of things. So there's a set of responsibilities around that too. I feel like trying to listen with intention and listen seriously to some of the things. I still don't know, I'm sitting and I'm trying to I'm trying to figure out what's next. I'll give you another concrete example, though. I had this amazing, we get to travel the world. I had this amazing experience in Manila, Philippines, where we landed, and our hosts, who we'd never met, said, all right, we know you're tired. But the first thing we're going to do, so there's some tables behind me. I don't know if you can see them, like kind of, I don't know, 4 foot by 8 foot tables. They brought us to what they called in English a boodle fight, and I don't know what it's called in Tagalog, but it was this feast. It was like 2 tables long feast that they laid out, seafood, amazingly prepared. They said, you can go be tired later. Now we essentially welcome you. We felt like family. I have never been so sort of bowled over by, I can't think of any other word for it, radical hospitality. Like the kindest people. And they didn't have to be that way. And there was nothing showy about this. It was like being embraced by family that we didn't know we had. And I think about that all the time. Like, what is my responsibility to those folks moving forward? What's my responsibility to like the idea of just this sort of like radical kindness for no reason whatsoever? And you're in the music world, you know, that's usually the opposite. Yeah, it's like usually any excuse, you know, any excuse not to be nice or to exploit somebody. It was so disorienting, the kindness that they showed us. And I'm bringing this up because I think there's something to that question too, like just trying to orient toward when can I do that for someone, whether it's those actual folks in Manila or whether it's somebody else in some other situation entirely. Like, I just feel super humbled by that, by having experienced that. I've never forgotten it, and I just feel like it should be some sort of like guiding principle in my own head or something. And so I hope this doesn't sound corny, but like it's one of the, you're in an educational environment, you know. There are times when being an educator is tiring.
Yes.
And then my wife is a high school teacher, and this is the period of exhaustion. She's got about 6 more weeks left. She is like a saint she's great kids, but you know, teaching is tiring. She's got a lot of students and it's exhausting. But part of me thinks that trying to be there for students, trying to hear them where they are, trying to understand where they're coming from, and trying to take seriously what they're doing is maybe one tiny way of paying forward this kind of thing, right? That is to say, like, I do have a responsibility to try to understand, maybe even back to the book a little bit, like understand where students are coming from as like the most important thing that I can do for them in that moment, and then we work from there. So I think it's fun to be in a band, but it's also, being in a band gives me maybe the energy to, I think there is a certain calling in teaching, and I hope that they play off each other. So I hope I'm answering your question in some way.
You are super answering the question, and in fact, this is making my brain go in a billion different directions in a really good way. So the ethics of caring is something that came up for me as you were talking, and I think about Patricia Hill Collins in her 1991 book about feminist epistemology, and how part of Black feminist epistemology is the ethics of caring, and the ethics of storytelling, and the experience of storytelling, and how telling stories is a form of knowledge. And I think as someone who's been on both sides of the classroom, like as a lifelong student and a lifelong learner, but as someone who's also been a TA, both my parents are professors, you know, so I've literally grown up in school, academic environments my entire life. I remember helping my dad grade his papers when I was like 12. Yeah. Oh my gosh. Like he would bring me to college sometimes and I would take notes on the board while he was talking, you know, like I've been around academia and education my entire life. And I've been around music my entire life too. And for me, maybe it's the body that I'm in, you know, maybe it's the fact that I'm a Black queer woman from the Bronx. I have never been able to separate my mission as a musician from my calling as a scholar. The two of them go hand in hand to me because a lot of my work is about liberation, and a lot of my work, as you know, you saw from the presentation, is about catharsis and about community building and mutual aid, and how music, specifically emo musicking, can be a vehicle for all of these things. So the reason why I asked you the question about, you know, what you think your responsibility is because I think the ethics of care is something that's absolutely huge. And I heard you talk about that in your response and allude to it, right? Whether you're caring for your students, whether you're experiencing care like you did in the Philippines, whether you're, I'm sure, experiencing a dispute in your band and you're like, I care and I love and I want this to sound good. Let's figure this out. I might be projecting. Shout out War Honey. Love you guys. You know? Yeah, it's like, it's all these things.
It's absolutely all these things. And as you mentioned, Colin's work, I should have said this earlier. Bell and Kimberly Crenshaw and some other folks are deeply interested. CRT is rooted in storytelling.
Yes.
There's this notion.
Say that again. Say it again.
Yeah, critical race theory is a fundamental method of doing critical race theory. And there's a woman in our field named Asia Martinez, AJA, but I believe her first name is pronounced Asia, talks about critical race storytelling. Alternative framing leads to alternative ways of knowing and alternative ways of being. And I say alternative to whatever this mainstream thing is that sort of allows for existing racial structures to feel unmarked, normalized, and so on. Storytelling becomes the embodied way to break through that, to knock down sort of normative thinking and insert different ways of understanding. And so,
I'm thinking about Munoz in particular. Now I'm thinking about Munoz in particular and his work with disidentifications.
And I'm less familiar with Munoz, but that was, you mentioned, and both other speakers. No, you did.
On my panel, I think everyone on my panel mentioned Munoz, and that's on everyone being queer. But
yeah, so that kind, and even I was talking yesterday about Dylan Robinson's notion of writing with, as a kind of, but it's definitely running in parallel with these ideas. This notion that to write with is to sort of place the body at the center. It is very much to queer one's own experience or to refuse a kind of normative reading and listening to music as this object that you sort of look at from afar. It's something that you feel in detail. So, yeah, I think this radical care is listening to music with intention and inviting others to do the same can be this radical caring act, I believe.
I love that. And that actually is a perfect transition into what I want to talk about next. So I want to talk about your latest EP, and I want to talk specifically about Bad Moons and the music video. So I'm looking over at my notes because I did an exercise that you encouraged us to do with Star, I think was the name of your student. Yeah. Shout out to Star. Yes. And I did a little bit of that when I was listening to Bad Moons for the first time. So I'm going to outline some of the things that I heard and some of the things that I noticed. Yeah. And then I would love to ask you questions in response about the theme of the music video, how you chose to go in the direction that y'all went in. Yeah. So the lush strings that tickle my brain and play percussively with the drums, that was something that I noticed absolutely immediately, just like the playful interaction between those two instruments. I absolutely loved it. And then you started off with a slow bass drum and a slurred sort of snare texture, which I think matches the heaviness and the black and white affect of the music video, right? And the slow moving frames, which anyone, if you haven't seen the music video, just watch it. It's absolutely phenomenal. It's a work of art. And then it shocked me at 52 seconds where there's someone being thrown into like the trunk of a car. And I was like, wait, what? What am I watching? And it seems to be, and correct me if I'm wrong, this is what I got out of it. The music video and the song seems to be a critique of masculinity almost, and a like toxic masculinity. And there's one line in particular that I really loved. It's, "I've been so many boys in this trench coat. Ask my ex-wife. She met Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. I know that should be a why, but none of my whys ever get answered." Tell me about that line. Tell me about that baller of a line.
I'm just the drummer. I didn't do it. I don't want to speak for Mike, but I will comment on my impression of the lyrical material here. Mike and I have known each other for a long time, and one of the things that I most love about Mike and found him most frustrating about Mike is he doesn't often, the lyrics come, we're working on a song for a long time, the lyrics just sort of come. This has been since day one of American Football. Like, dude, you gonna sing in this band? He's like, yeah. I'm like, you want a microphone? No. So things are going on in Mike's head while we're working out the music. So you asked me kind of 3 layers of questions. The song, the instrumental dimensions of the song is almost bifurcated. There's almost 2 parts. Mm-hmm. And so they were doing what I interpreted to be, we've never done this before to my knowledge, something like this kind of lo-fi hip hop thing that they were trying to do. Like there's the sample. Yes. And so I was trying to channel my like Questlove or like my try, like the
Little
way
Tribe Called Quest
the way that the way that Questlove would respond to some loop, like I was just trying to channel my own version, like he and then Questlove of course is indexing, lots of kind of soul and art. There's a particular kind of style. So I'm just trying to back of my head. All right, what's I just want this. That's what I was going for as the drummer. Now, when Mike drops those lyrics, right, in a bunch, then it seems pretty clear. I think Mike is really trying to, lyrically in this record, trying to take self-assessment and talk about some of the ways in which we're all in middle age, and you were talking about growth before. I think places in which all of us have sort of, looking back, think, we didn't do it, right? That we failed in X or Y or Z sort of way. Now, I'm not responsible for lyrics, but I'm even trying to play in a certain way where it's like, well, what does it mean to embody as a drummer? What is the feel of regret?
Yes.
Or what is the feel of what is the feel of regret, and then rage and catharsis, and then acceptance? I feel like the whole larger record, I can't wait for people to hear it. We've been at this for a while, but I think that there's very much a narrative of sort of middle-aged acceptance there. Now you come to the video.
Yes.
And I do think, to the degree, now we didn't make the video. Some other amazing artists did. But I think the idea was in a really kind of general way. Let's talk a little bit about this idea of masculinity at the moment. I was nervous about it because the problem with doing that is that it's too easy to slide into simplistic / problematic conversations, because the last thing that I was like, we're not writing songs about, the plight of boys or something like that. But the song does try to understand, I think, or tries to, what does it mean to be a middle-aged person looking back at boyhood, a middle-aged man looking back at boyhood, and some of the meanness of that. So that moment in the video is an embodied reality, I think, for a lot of young kids, to be picked on in that way or thrown in the trunk in that way. Because you're asking me questions on 3 levels, it's like the whole package, I think, conveys a particular kind of sit with the unease that is this time and place. I will say there's a moment where there's a young man is sort of making a video and there's a gun flapping around.
Yes.
You remember this?
Yes.
And I was like, I don't know. I don't know that, I've got kids. I don't know. I don't know if I'm cool with that, right? But Alex, one of the directors, was like, well, it becomes clear later in the video that the gun is one of those airsoft guns. It's like it's marked as such, and it's a kind of embodiment of a certain idea of whatever that video is supposed to be. And then later, if you remember, there's a sweet moment in the video where that same guy gives headphones, and there's this look straight at the camera, and
Yes.
it's like a deer in the headlights look, as opposed to this sort of tough guy ethos. And Alex helped me to understand. I think his pushback there was like, for me in particular, was like, okay, I'm glad that he pushed it, because that is a moment. That said, somebody else, the video feels, we rarely dabble in reality in that way. You know what I mean? There's I think there's.
I love it so much. It's such
a I don't want to say it's a departure from your other stuff, but it is a new way of experiencing American football. And that's why I was so excited to talk to you about this one.
It made me nervous, yeah. And there's part of me that I think, and I hope I don't sound like a pretentious ass. One of the things that I've always been so proud of to be associated with these idiots is, if nothing else, we have tried to be sincere or authentic or something, right? And sometimes it's probably cringy in some of the ways that we've been talking about this. But sometimes there is a way in which I think our sincerity has not necessarily forced us out into the real world in that particular way. So I was like, boy, I don't know. I don't know if I want to make a video about kind of manhood and boyhood and all this stuff. But I'm so glad that it came across, it sounds like to you as a viewer, in the way that it did, where there's a kind of earnestness to it, and I'm glad that we made the video that we made. But I would be lying to you if I said it didn't make me a little nervous. You know what I mean? So,
I mean, I feel like that's a key component of new art. All of the stuff that I've made, whether it's been solo compositions or things with War Honey, there's always been an element of nerves associated with it, of like, is this going to be received well? Is the message going to translate? Are people going to be impacted by this in a positive way? And that's the thing that I love the most about Bad Moons, actually. Specifically, okay, I'm gonna get a little technical now, right? Yeah. If you go to 4 minutes and 5 seconds, you should totally just follow along if you're listening to this. If you go to 4 minutes and 5 seconds, the drums come in with drags on the snares. Can you tell me about how you structured the drums for the latter part of the song and how it aids in storytelling? Because I love the drums from I love it in general, but I would say from 4 minutes and 5 seconds onward, you were making some magic with the kit, and I want to get a little bit of insight into how you decided to do that.
Is 4 minutes, is that the breakdown part? Is
Yes.
that middle? Okay,
Yep.
So the song, I think I might have used this language. The song was bifurcated. We didn't have the second part written.
Oh.
So we work with this amazing guy, Sonny DuPerry, who is a sort of part of so many of kind of neo shoegaze records, like kind of and he's worked with Trent Reznor and other people, and he's worked with 30 Seconds to Mars. Yes. He cut his teeth with some of these these kind of like foundation art. But Sonny is a drummer. And Sonny is one of my favorite people to work with, because I felt like there was a lot that was unspoken. Mm-hmm. But he's like, we need something at the end. Just play something. I'm like, well, we didn't play something. My
least favorite thing as a drummer, just play something.
I came in with every other part pretty much written. We had spent an enormous amount of time getting demos really sort of more or less together, because I had talked to the guys about, look, I want to go in for a couple days and I want to feel like I know what I'm playing, and then I want to get those takes, then you guys come in and then we'll change whatever we want to change. But we had some issues in previous records with me being like, I don't even know what I'm supposed to be doing at this point, because I've got basically four really good drummers telling me how to, and I was like, just give me a minute. This was the only song where that wasn't the case, but Sonny was like, I had played some little figure that ended up being the fast part. And he's like, I'm just gonna let the tape roll, take 7 or 8 passes, just do your thing. The part that you're referencing, we tracked later, but we needed a way to get from the quiet sort of lo-fi hip hop part, the Questlove part, to the end that's big and sort of like post-rocky. I don't know, there was just something about the way, let myself in the dark, the way that Mike articulated that felt like my job in American football often is to fill in blanks, or to play whatever is happening. I have to flip flip it on its head.
I was thinking, it felt like his tonality was very staccato, and then you were more like.
That's it. So,
like,
yeah, you don't need me. That's the so in that sense, like, I've always loved playing with those guys, because whatever it is that they're doing, just it invites anything but the usual, for whatever that means. And sometimes it probably means overthinking, and the usual would be more straightforward and more fun. But in that instance, I just feel like whatever Mike was doing sort of necessitated that little middle section, and we were trying to get from relaxed to big, and it felt like small, especially because he's saying a lot in those lyrics. There's a lot going on in that middle section.
So much going on.
So I appreciate you asking me about that, because it was one of those fun moments where I didn't have a preconceived notion, but we sort of got there, and one of those moments where the song tells you what it needs. So that I think that's the best I think that's you've helped me to articulate out loud maybe something I hadn't really thought about, which is, why did that come about that way? But I think it was to get from the beginning to the end.
I absolutely love that. I love talking shop with drummers just because a lot of people want to talk about lyrics, which of course I alluded to some of the lyrics. And I know that when you are thinking about drumming, at least for me, I listen to the lyrics first and I think about the textures that are like for My Little House, you know, the part that I shown, like I think about the textures that I want to convey. And so I have this thing, synesthesia. Are you familiar with what synesthesia is? I didn't know that was a thing until I was like, so we all agree that triplets are green. And people were like, what the fuck are you talking about? Like, no, we don't know that triplets are green. So, you know, whenever I'm hearing a lot of the more foundational moments of the music, like when Gabby is puttering around on the piano or Ben is trying something on guitar, or Taylor's trying something on bass. Although we had Brian Kish on bass for My Little House. Shout out to Brian Kish. I find myself listening to all of the other parts speak first, and then I try and come in with drums, because for me, the drums are like an offering almost. It's like a sonic and almost a spiritual offering. It's I want to hear what else is being presented, because the drums are loud and they can be very overpowering, and it can be kind of rude almost, you know, for lack of a better term. Like it almost seems like if I'm going to have this very loud, powerful instrument, I need to treat it with care. And I need to meet my other fellow musicians who are in this creative space with me with care. So for me, that care looks like closing my eyes, listening to the other parts, feeling it in my body, and then trying to replicate what I'm feeling in my body with the drum set. And it seems like there's a lot of ethics of care and freedom and fluidity and catharsis that was a part of you coming up with this track and the drums for this track. As you said, it started off as you didn't even have a part for the second half, and then it just kind of organically came together in that way. So thank you for sharing that. I am going to ask two final questions.
Yes.
First one is, in a sentence, what does emo music mean to you?
I think it means sincerity. I think it means I think it means sincerity, and I hope it now, and Eva, I'm learning, it means acceptance. And I think that those are two powerful moments, or those are two powerful sentiments that I think this music is especially good at. Trying to recognize sort of what folks are going through and live with it. You don't get past it, but maybe live with it, and maybe that's a good thing.
And then the final question I have for you is, what are you most looking forward to in your upcoming album? What do you want people to know?
I can't wait for it to come out. There are, you were talking earlier about drums listening. There are a couple moments on the new record where a couple of songs came from drum parts where I was like, I think I got a thing. See what you all think about it. I'm excited for people to hear that the first track and the last track kind of start a certain thing and end a certain thing, and they were both sort of, there was a drum beat that sort of was propulsive for the whole thing. So I'm excited to see if people are into that. I think the whole, I'm so happy about this record, because I think the whole record is, I think as I said earlier, I think it's about a kind of like dealing with middle age and acceptance and the things that you cannot change, like the 12-step thing, right? Give me that whole bit. And so I hope that people will sit with the feel of the record, and I'm excited to see. Bad Moons is an absolute outlier on the record.
Really?
It serves a function. It serves a crucial function. Believe it or not, I believe that Bad Moons is kind of a normalizing moment, like almost a moment of relief, on the record, because the record is the record is batty. So I hope, and a part of me is like so glad that came out first, because I'm like, it's nothing like the rest of what's happening. So that it spoke to you is awesome.
Steve, thank you so much for having this conversation with me. I learned a lot from you, not just at Emo Con, but in this conversation. I'm so excited for everything that happens with American football, and we will be in contact.
Fantastic. Thank you. Yeah, thank you. This has been a blast. We should go. We need to get to a keynote. So we should do that. But yeah, this has been awesome. Thank you so much. I haven't had this much fun in a long time.
Thank you.